Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Rachel Bevan, so I'm Director of Statistics Division here in Bangkok, ESCAP. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's Asia-Pacific Stats Café, which is on balancing access and confidentiality and on the role of synthetic data in official statistics. So today we're going to discuss one of the critical challenges facing producers of official statistics, and that's how to strike that balance between providing access to the data, but also maintaining confidentiality. And this challenge is particular of officials in an era where there's an increasing demand for granular data and accessible data for research, policy making, and also for public use, but also where many of the issues that we're trying to measure today as well, they really require data from multiple different data sources. And often administrative data or big data are the only ones that we can actually get that information from. They're not things that we can actually get from perhaps what's more common for the work of NSOs, things like censuses and surveys. So we're all kind of, working in this era where we're having to balance how do we bring those different data together. Much of the work that we're doing, obviously, in national statistical offices is really underpinned by the fundamental principles of official statistics, and they help to guide us in that balance. And particularly it's Principle 6, which reminds us that individual data collected by statistical agencies, whether referring to natural or legal persons, must be kept strictly confidential and used exclusively for statistical purposes. So safeguarding this confidentiality is not just a matter of ethical responsibility, but also it's really fundamental to maintaining the trust of the public who provide the information. But we know as well that although confidentiality is so important, we also need to make sure, though, that actually academics, policymakers actually do have access to the information. And we know that they don't just need access to aggregate information, they need that really detailed analysis, the detailed information in order to actually look at what the impact of different policies will be and to actually make a difference in terms of decision making. And there are traditional methods in terms of granting limited access to trusted users or providing aggregated data. They've worked fairly well, but they're also very limited. So the vetting process for trusted users can be time consuming, and it also doesn't necessarily guarantee the data security. And that's where synthetic data presents a really exciting alternative. So by replicating the statistical properties of original data sets, while minimizing the risk of disclosure, synthetic data offers the potential to provide really rich insights without compromising the confidentiality. So in this session today, we're going to explore the use of synthetic data in official statistics, learn more about the guide which has been developed by the Economic Commission of Europe, and we're going to hear from countries as well that have begun to implement or are considering using this guide. So I'm really confident that today's discussion will provide valuable insights into how synthetic data can be used, but also will really help us to look at how we can make sure that the data we provide is accessible, but also making sure we do actually adhere to those, the confidentiality that we must adhere to. Certainly from a personal perspective, I'm hoping to gain a lot more insight. It's not an area I'm very familiar with, so I'm looking forward to hearing from our great speakers that we've got. And it's great that we have got people who've got experience from very different backgrounds. So with that, I would just encourage all the participants, as ever, please do kind of write any comments and reflections in the chat. I know we've got 4 presentations to listen to, but we do try to encourage everyone else as well. Please contribute through the chat. And I'm going to pass over to our moderator, Afsaneh Yazdani, who is going to introduce the speakers and moderate the session. So thank you so much. Thank you to the speakers, but also thank you to the help to guide us in that balance, not just from our region, but also beyond as well. Over to you, Afsaneh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for kind opening remarks. And hello, everyone, and welcome to our Stats Café session today. We have 70 participants, which is great. My name is Afsaneh Yazdani, and I'm pleased to moderate the session today. As Rachel mentioned, we are going to discuss synthetic data in official statistics as a solution to make a balance between access and confidentiality. We have a line of excellent speakers with us. And here you can see the agenda of the meeting today. First, we will have a presentation by Dr. Christoph Jones, who is a statistician at the UNECE, and he will set the scene and give an overview of synthetic data for official statistics and the
persons must be kept strictly confidential.
UNECE. Then we will hear from our colleague from Thailand, Ms. Tabisa Srikwan. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. And Thailand has felt the need to give access to macro data, and they are now exploring the methods. So we can hear from them that why they are looking into synthetic data. And then we will have colleague from New Zealand, Alistair Ramsden, who will talk about New Zealand experience. And then we will have colleague from Singapore, Dr. Andy Xian, who will also share with us the experience from Singapore. And at the end, we will have Stats Café evaluation survey and closing. Before I start, I would like just to mention a couple of housekeeping tips that these Stats Cafe sessions are recorded and video will be shared on Stats Cafe webpage, and all the presentations will also be uploaded there. So in case you would like to refer to them later, you know where to find them. And also if put them in the chat box and we will go back to them at the end of the meeting. And please keep your microphones muted when you are not speaking, so we won't have any background noise when colleagues are presenting. So our first presentation is synthetic data for official statistics by Dr. Christopher Jones. Dr. Christopher is a statistician at Statistics Division of UNECE, currently working on modernization of official statistics, and he is based in Geneva. He has worked in a variety of statistical and analytical roles over past 18 years, both within UN entities and also UK civil service, where he assisted establishing a new series of statistical publications. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Afsane. Yeah, my name is Christopher Jones. I work for UNECE. I've been involved in some past work on synthetic data, and I'm the organizer of
Information, they need that really detailed.
Statistical data confidentiality. I'd very much like to thank ESCAP for agreeing to convene this webinar, which I think is very useful. And I'm particularly grateful to Afsane for being the driving force behind making this happen. So, synthetic data. Well, what is synthetic data? So people often try to think about concepts that they are already familiar with in terms of simulation, dummy data, artificial data, generated data, or even deepfake data. Each of these has ideas has a little bit of truth to them, but maybe the best way to think of it is as being artificial data that mimics the properties of real data. Just to motivate the purpose of synthetic data, it's worth reiterating some of what Rachel was saying earlier, that the people who produce statistics, or organizations who produce statistics, have a bit of a balancing act. And previously, Principle 6 of the fundamental principles was discussed, the confidentiality of the personal data. Balanced against that is the desire to provide equal access to insights from that data. I'm perhaps misquoting Principle 1, which talks about sharing statistics on an impartial basis. It talks about statistics, not insights, and not microdata. But I think in general, there is a desire to unleash the value that is within data to the public. So the situation is changing, though, because there's an ever greater demand for detail. And the problem with this is that the more detail that you provide, the harder it is to guarantee the confidentiality of data. So you can think of examples where you might have a statistical release that provides lots of tables with lots of breakdowns and things like that. Each of these, each extra level of detail that you provide increases the risk of disclosing someone's personal details. So in terms of discussing the confidentiality part of the problem, there are a number of ways that producers of statistics will try to deal with the confidentiality aspect. They will try to remove names and personal details from record level data sets, but also tabulating aggregates of the data, such as averages or totals, perhaps broken down by other variables, is another way of doing that. But each one of these has its own shortcomings. So in the case of removing people's names from the record level data sets, otherwise known as microdata, this doesn't necessarily prevent a particular individual in the data set being identified. And that could, for example, happen by comparing the unit record level data with data from other sources. It could even be looking at information that's available on someone's Facebook page or LinkedIn. There's a growing field called open source intelligence, where there are ways of finding out things about people. In terms of the issues with tabulated aggregates, this also has its problems. And if you think of an output like the census, that tends to have many, many different tables released with many different breakdowns. And if you compare those tables very carefully, you can sometimes try to like reconstruct what the original data set may have looked like. The other issue with tables is that they're just less useful for doing certain types of analysis. So, for example, if you want to do data mining or train a machine learning model, you probably want very granular data. In terms of the equal access side of the problem, it's often not feasible to grant equal access to these analytical insights. And often certain trusted researchers will be given privileged access to confidential microdata, with other people being given just having access to these published tables that are usually available on a website. And this gives a two-tier level of access. When you compare the, I'll just go forward, sorry. How do I go to, all right, I'll try. Okay, brilliant. And so the issue with this is that with this having two different levels of access is that a lot of the value contained in the microdata might not be utilized. So if you consider how much it costs to collect data from, say, for example, the census or from a survey, and if you think about all of the analytical insights that are contained in that data set and all of the different decisions that they could potentially inform in terms of, policy making, business planning, or decisions made by individuals, most of them will not be used because there is this problem of getting access to microdata. And obviously, the more detailed the data, the more insights. So the microdata is perhaps the most valuable. And as mentioned, those outside of academia and government have this lower level of access. And all of that is motivated by the need to protect confidentiality, which is obviously quite justified. So whenever you have a dilemma, then the natural thing to wonder is there a third option? And that third option is perhaps trying to separate the data from the analytical insights that they contain. And this, to some extent, is what synthetic data might be able to do sometimes and to some degree. There's a lot of caveats there, but the basic idea is making the insights derived from synthetic data as close as possible to those that you would obtain from the real data, but also making the synthetic data as hard as possible to identify people from. So the first of those constraints or requirements might be
learn more about the
utility of the data set, whereas the latter, the managing risk, the making it hard to identify people is the risk element. So, but there's always going to be a trade-off between risk and utility. So in the diagram, I've plotted on axes notions of risk and utility, where there's a purple X
countries as well that have begun to
microdata here, and then the other purple X is just random noise. So you can see that real data has very high utility, optimal utility, but it also has maximum risk, whereas random noise would have low utility and low risk, obviously. Maybe tabular data might be somewhere in between the two. What it's interesting to think about is whether the zone marked by the green circle is achievable. And this is where synthetic data can get quite interesting, that if you can generate data sets that have pretty good utility and pretty low risk, then it becomes useful to try to produce and release synthetic data. One slight issue is that in terms of the risk and utility axes, there are different ways of measuring risk and utility. I think this will be picked up by a later presentation, but to a certain extent, they are in the eye of the beholder. For example, if you know how someone's going to use the data, it's easier to produce synthetic data in a way that will optimize the risk and utility trade-off. So, for example, if you wanted to produce a data set that preserved the average for a particular variable in the synthetic data, that's possible. Similarly, if you wanted to produce a synthetic microdata set where the correlation between two of the variables matched those of the real data set, that's also possible. But if you don't know in advance how the data will be used, then it becomes harder. And there are various different use cases for synthetic data, everything from providing general data sets for training purposes to providing these bespoke data sets where you know how they're going to be used. So this, what I've said so far, it perhaps raises more questions than answers in terms of how to produce synthetic data, because I've hinted that there are many ways of doing that. What to use it for, this goes into the question of use cases, and then whether it's useful and whether it's safe. And this illustrates the need for guidance, which has been produced by UNECE about a couple of years ago. So at the end of 2022, we released the Synthetic Data for Official Statistics Starter Guide. This came out of a project that was led by Statistics Canada under the auspices of the high-level group for the modernization of official statistics. And it was led by a lady called Kate Burnett-Isaacs. It had quite a lot of contributors to the guide, including one of the speakers today. This guide, it introduces the concepts of synthetic data. It provides entry points into the wider literature, which can get quite technical. It talks about use cases So elaborating on what I mentioned a moment ago. And it also talks about different methodologies for making synthetic data. There are many. There are many from more perhaps more traditional statistical methods that statisticians would recognize, to ones that are based on deep learning and more in the artificial intelligence and machine learning direction. So one of them, generative adversarial networks, is becoming quite popular. And I just mentioned in passing that that's the same family of algorithms that are used to make deepfake images, just to give a little bit of flavor as to what we're trying to achieve. The guide talks about the pros and cons of these different methods. Each has its strengths and weaknesses. And it also talks about ways of measuring the risk and utility that I was talking about trade-offs with a while ago. And it lists some software applications that might be useful, such as SynthPop. And that's it for this introduction. But basically, we are happy to supply a free printed copy of the user guide to anyone who would like it. If you would like a copy, you can use the QR code to order one to be delivered to you. Or you can even indicate if you'd like to receive notifications about future events related to synthetic data. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the overview. And as you mentioned, it's complicated, so we cannot cover everything here in this Stats Café session. So colleagues, if you want to learn more about the guidelines, you could go to this reference developed by ECE. And in case you have any questions, I'm sure that you can reach out to Chris. And I believe this is the QR code is your email or maybe a form. Not sure.
It's a form, but I'm happy to supply my email if needed. Thanks.
All right, perfect. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is a colleague from Thailand. As I mentioned earlier, they are now exploring some new ways of giving access to microdata. They have had some challenges. They are already using some other approaches, and now they want to use synthetic data. We have Ms. Tavisap Sirkwan with us, and she will present on this. And Ms. Tavisap is an experienced statistician, and she currently works as Director of Social Information Group at the National Statistics Office of Thailand. She leads the integration of social, natural resources and environmental data while promoting data-driven decision-making and supporting government agencies in developing data catalogs. So over to you, Ms. Tavisap.
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tavisap Sirkwan from the National Statistical Office of Thailand. I would like to thank ESCAP, Dr. Christopher Jones, Mr. Dayan, and Mr. Yan for their efforts in bringing us together and promoting synthetic data knowledge. I encourage everyone to listen closely to the valuable insight our expert will share today.
I think you should take the control, Ms. Tavisap. Yes, you took it, right.
On the topic why we need synthetic data, let me begin by explaining why synthetic data is so important for our organization. The National Statistical Office of Thailand has three key responsibilities. First, we produce essential statistical data that helps guide the government in shaping national development policies. Second, we oversee and manage the country's entire statistical system. And finally, we provide data services to government agencies, the private sector, and the general public. In providing these services, we also handle personal data, which is why we are eager to explore synthetic data solutions to improve our work. With the introduction of the Personal Data Protection Act of 2019, safeguarding data has become even more critical. At the same time, legal restrictions have made accessing real-world data more challenging. We believe synthetic data offers a practical solution, enabling us to navigate these challenges and continue our work without compromising data privacy. And nowadays, the National Statistical Office of Thailand, like many other national statistical offices, takes several measures to protect personal data. At TNSO, we utilize three key methods of data protection. The first is anonymization, where we modify or remove identifiable details from personal information, either directly or indirectly. For example, we might replace someone's name with a random identifier to ensure their identity remains private. The second method is encryption, where we encode sensitive data, making it unreadable without a proper decryption key. For example, think of encryption like putting the data into a lock box that only authorized individuals can open with a special key. Finally, we employ column deletion, where we remove specific columns containing personal data to ensure it cannot be accessed. In practice, this means removing sensitive information such as national ID numbers from the dataset, making it impossible to trace back to individuals. TNSO needs synthetic data for several reasons. It helps us ensure privacy and confidentiality, comply with data protection regulations, and supports joint data analysis across multiple projects. Additionally, synthetic data helps enhance access for research and policy making while addressing budget and resource constraints, ensuring that operations remain efficient and effective. Synthetic data offers several practical benefits. It helps protect personal information and reduce security risks, while also giving us more flexibility in how we use data. For example, we can safely use synthetic data in training new staff or testing systems. It also allows us to conduct joint analysis on different datasets, improving our operational efficiency and decision-making. Synthetic data plays a vital role at the National Statistical Office, especially when it comes to handling personal information security. For example, in our national census, we can share valuable insight with researchers using synthetic data without exposing any real personal details, ensuring privacy. It also helps us reduce security risks when collaborating with external partners, as we can test systems without the fear of data breaches. This flexibility extends to training and system testing. When using real data isn't feasible, we can simulate real-world scenarios with synthetic data, making our processes more practical. Moreover, synthetic data supports global research collaborations by sharing synthetic datasets with international partners. We maintain privacy while still fostering meaningful collaboration. Lastly, we can simulate past survey results when testing new methodologies, allowing us to improve efficiency and refine our operations without relying on real data, which can sometimes be difficult to access. As we gain a better understanding of synthetic data and successfully test key variables, we plan to launch a few pilot projects. For example, we could replace confidential microdata with synthetic data in sensitive surveys to ensure complete privacy protection and serve all users. Another project
who will talk about
synthetic data from different surveys, such as household income and labor force data. This enables us to analyze trends across sectors without exposing personal information. Additionally, we could use synthetic data to test new analytical tools and systems, ensuring they work effectively before being applied to real datasets. As I finish my presentation, I sincerely encourage all of you to explore the benefit of synthetic data. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you stay with us to hear from our expert who will share valuable insight in the next session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Risab. And yeah, as you also mentioned, some of the traditional ways of support. And at the end, we will protecting the confidentiality of the data. They do not completely eliminate the risk of re-identification, or they reduce the utility of data. So it's good to find new ways, including this the use of synthetic data. So survey and closing is our colleague from Stats New Zealand, and they have used synthetic data for a while, and there are a couple of examples of how they have been using. So we now want to hear from Mr. Alistair Ramsden, who is a senior design analyst at Stats New Zealand, specialized in confidentiality and statistical disclosure control methods, including synthetic data and a range of other methods related to applying generic statistical business process model. He has experience in both public and private sector, and he holds a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy, and including studies related to ethic, logic, legal studies, and so on. So over to you, Alistair.
Thank you, Sane. Tēnā koutou nao mai haere mai no Aotearoa, or greetings and welcome from New Zealand. I just need to take control of the presentation. So what I will be doing is talking about some of Stats New Zealand's experiences with balancing access and
the presentation
and the use of synthetic data as a way to give effect to a good statistical disclosure control or confidentiality practice, which is in turn a way to give effect to privacy and to minimize privacy harm. And I think I will also touch a little bit on a methodology called differential privacy, which is it's a way to give a particular or put a particular number or a particular mathematical guarantee on the privacy harm of individuals contributing their responses to surveys on that line between a highly disclosive, high risk, high utility kind of data set, or one that has a lot of perturbation or random noise added to it, which has lower risk and lower utility. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about will cover some of the things that Chris Jones has talked about, and I'll probably gloss over them a bit. What is statistical confidentiality? What is synthetic data? Then how can we, or what benefits do synthetic data have? And I think I might gloss over that a little bit as well. But also, how do we measure the safety and utility of synthetic data, and then some methodologies that Stats New Zealand is using, and some examples of the use of those methodologies, and some plans for our future use and innovation of synthetic data methods. I particularly like this quote by I think it's George Duncan and his two other co-authors of this book, Statistical Confidentiality Principles and Practices. So what exactly is statistical confidentiality? Simply put, it is the stewardship of data to be used for statistical purposes. Stewardship, as expressed in statistical confidentiality, is an active embrace of responsibility for both protecting data and ensuring its beneficial use. Explicitly, it requires proper practices for both providing and restricting access to data products. And at Stats New Zealand, like many other NSOs, I imagine we do have a two-tier system where we have public releases, which includes releases that we pre-build for both government and business sector customers, and also the general public, as well as customized data requests where people can come to us and say, can you give us an output of a particular kind? That's that kind of lower tier of access, and then a researcher tier of access is in what's called the data lab, or the integrated data infrastructure at Stats New Zealand, which is there's two databases, one of business data called the longitudinal business database, and the other one is called the integrated data infrastructure, and that's of a person data. And those data sets are curated and kept in a secure data lake, and people can or researchers can get access to them if they meet the requirements. And just to give you some idea about what kind of requirements researchers need to get this sort of higher level of access to the de-identified but not confidentialized per se microdata. I've put a link in the chat to information we put out in public about that. What I will say is that all of the researchers that output data from the data lab, they have to go through the same kind of statistical disclosure control.
Past 18 years.
What Stats New Zealand does when it produces data for public consumption. So the outputs from the data lab have the same kind of disclosure control and go through a data checking process. So I think that's important as well. Now, so there's a range of literature on the subject, which goes back to Rubin in 1993, and actually I'd say the first time that I met synthetic data generation tables was when I played Dungeons and Dragons, believe it or not, because there's lots of stochastic methods in those kinds of games. Now, what I would say is that synthetic data is any at least partially noised or perturbed data with or without some retained inferential validity. Sometimes people will call synthetic data without retained inferential validity dummy data. Substantively, we're not terribly interested in dummy data, but we are interested in synthetic data that has at least some retained inferential validity. Now, another point to realize is that any confidentialized descriptive statistics summary table can be reverse transformed into a synthetic data unit record set. So that's important. I'm going to show you an example of that. Also, it's important that the results in the synthetic data which are inferentially valid, that needs to be communicated to customers. So providing customers with the metadata about that is essential. Here's an example of a process. Original council weights, so this is original survey data or original administrative data, can be mapped into sums of those original council weights, then goes through a confidentiality process which produces sums of perturbed council weights, which can then be mapped to synthetic council weights. And so This part is what we hold securely as NSOs, and this part is what we might publish as a tabular output. Obviously, there's other types of outputs as well, but I'm going to focus on tabular outputs as an example. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily easily readable, but this is this is trying to explain in more detail what I've just talked about, where you have a unit record data set, you will tabulate it, pass it through a confidentiality process and output that. And this is what we would be outputting into the public domain. But then from that table, you can then generate a unit record data set, which is a synthetic unit record data set. And here's an example with some basic variables filled in. Stats New Zealand, for a lot of our outputs, we rely on a method called random rounding to base 3. This method is not a fully differentially private method, but it is partially differentially private in that it protects values or counts in this table of 1 and 2. So that's individuals or pairs of individuals with an epsilon of log 2. So that means that this one record here has been perturbed to no records, and this 2 records here has been perturbed to 3 records. We call it's random rounding to base 3 because those are the output values. So all of the values are multiples of 3. And actually, we also provide suppression where the data meets certain numerical confidentiality thresholds, and if that's the case, we will also then suppress counts of 0 to 5. So that would mean sometimes these zeros and threes will be put in as suppressed cells. Okay. So benefits of synthetic data. It's very useful for testing and training with improved data safety. One of the pieces of work that I've worked on recently, or about 2 or 3 years ago, was that the Stats New Zealand Audit Office and the Stats New Zealand Technology Services, or ICT Office, said we would like to have a method to ensure that we're using data as safely as possible internally, and so it's substantively Stats New Zealand policy to use synthetic data internally for testing and training unless there's a good reason to use the original data. Data with appropriate statistical disclosure control or uncertainty. So I guess the uncertainty is, if you look at this table, whereas this record x equals 2 is the same as this x dash equals 2, there's no guarantee that in fact this record is in this data set that many times. The point is that there's a level of obfuscation of the count of records and therefore a level of uncertainty injected. And also where there are small counts, quite often they are completely dropped off the outputs. Yes, I think I've already covered providing users with metadata is essential because users need to know in a synthetic data set what portion of the inferential validity is retained because they need to not use other analyses of that data because they won't be valid analyses. How can we measure the safety and utility of synthetic data? Well, I would refer again to the Synthetic Data for Official Statistics Starter Guide document. I was one of the contributors to this document, but by no means the only one. And in fact, some of the really key names in synthetic data innovation, like the people who produced the SynthPop package, Gillian Raab from University of Edinburgh was one of those people. She was involved with production of this guide, and also Georg Dreschler, who wrote a book in 2011 on the subject, and I think he's just recently published a paper on the subject as well, doing an update. But oh no, that's the wrong link. Sorry, I'm so sorry about that. That's it there. Okay. Yeah, this is a link to the 2011 book by George Dreschler, Synthetic Data Sets for Statistical Disclosure Control, and I recommend that. It's a very good book that covers a range of different synthetic data methods and processes. In this guide, the synthetic data starter guide, there are a range of sections on both considerations relating to what kind of disclosure control method you want to use, and also what kind of utility measures you want to use.
That
your comparisons between your synthetic data and your original data to be able to describe to users how safe it is to use and or how useful it is to use. So methods for use of synthetic data at Stats New Zealand. Our key method is to take an input of original data, process it, and have an output of synthetic data. We're interested in the objective and the users of the product. We're interested in the utility and the safety of the output, and whether it aligns with our relevant standards. And there's another kind of slightly more detailed example of how we might do it. We take data from our data lab data, maybe a sample model that's using synthetic data methods, and then test it for utility and for safety. And if we've can test it and show that whatever criteria we've set for ourselves in terms of utility and safety are being met, we can then release that to either researchers if it's particularly detailed granular data, and then they can produce outputs using our public methodology, which is called the Microdata Output Guide, or we can potentially release it direct to public customers. Some examples of use of synthetic data at Stats New Zealand. So all of our 2018 census and 2023 census output data tables use that random rounding to base 3 method, so they're all substantively synthesized in a way. This is the same for many other descriptive statistic summary tables. A significant proportion of Stats New Zealand published data is substantively identical to synthetic data, with some inferential validity retained, often quite a lot of inferential validity retained. And the method we use is more or less a way that we produce summary tables because most people want answers to their questions or solutions to their problems, and often analyses of summary tables is what you want. But then you can, as I say, backcast into a synthetic data set, and that can be using a fully conditional specification model or one of the other models that are referred to in the starter guide. There are some examples of this. In 2023, we did a New Zealand grid geography project where we did a very granular geographic cut of the population, and that involved not only our standard methods
to
adding more noise with a more fully differentially private method, and also some record swapping, which means that in some cases, some people in one particular geographic region were swapped with other people in another one. And there's a example of that outputs from that table. These kind of pale green cells here are all values of population between between 1 and 10. The grey areas have no population at all, and then these peaks are where the cities are, obviously, and that's quite a granular method, and it could be, you can examine that data at your leisure. here's a link to that data. Then also I helped Nicholson Consulting and Kotata Insight do a project called the Ha'ara Putamamo Te Reo Māori project, which the customers for that was primarily the New Zealand Ministry of Education, but there were other Māori education groups as well. Substantively, what they wanted was a synthetic data unit record, so a synthetic unit record file of New Zealand with information about who speaks Te Reo Māori and their age and their geography and their education level for the purpose of modelling and forecasting the outcomes of particular interventions into the uptake of the Indigenous language in New Zealand. And there is some outputs from that project, and there's a link to more detail about that project as well. Right, so in future, we want to investigate possible adjustments to our methods. Our current method for tables is, I would call it, very minimalistically partially differentially private. We would like to investigate either moving to a more differentially private, partially differentially private, or a fully differentially private method for 2028 census. That is an open research question at the moment. I don't know whether that will happen or not, but substantively, the US Census Bureau has led the charge to using differential privacy on a broadly, even though there are some pitfalls with that, which I won't get into today. But Stats New Zealand, I guess, wants to be a fast follower, and there are some other elements as well. So it's a very interesting area of research and work at present. Okay.
Thank you very much, Alistair, for giving us an overview of how Stats New Zealand is using synthetic data, and also sharing with us the links to some resources that colleagues can have a look later on. So we don't have much.
Each extra level of detail.
We move to our last speaker, Dr. Andy Xiang, who is a Chief Technology Officer at Singapore Department of Statistics, leading digital services and transformation initiatives and analytics resources. He manages the Trusted Center, which supplies core admin data for analysis. He improved business service by integrating admin data and also established anonymized microdata access program. So you should have a lot to share with us. Over to you, Andy.
Okay, thank you, Asani. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andy from Singapore Department of Statistics. This afternoon, I'll just share very quickly on how we view synthetic data, how we use it for data exploration and research. So very quickly, the Department of Statistics in Singapore actually play two roles. One, as the National Stats Office. Two, we are the Trusted Center for Individual and Business Government Administrative Data, right? And with these two roles, we have identified for ourselves to be the first stop for data and data services in Singapore for both internal and external users. Okay, and of course, the environment today, I think we are all aware, is that there is a lot of pressure for the use of data, both in economic and social setting, and there is a lot of data that's needed for evidence-based policy making and so on and so forth. And a lot of us in the National Stats Office are well aware of that data value chain from collection, processing, compilation, and all the way analysis, dissemination. How can we use the best of technology to do our work in the most efficient manner, of course, while ensuring confidentiality and security, right? So let me just move very quickly. Because of our two roles, right, there are two pieces of legislation that govern how we act and handle the data accordingly. The first one is the Statistics Act, which empower us to collect and share data for statistical purpose. And specifically, it allows for DOS to share data that's collected under Stat Act as aggregated data and also as anonymized microdata, which can then be shared with public agency, government researcher, or commissioned academic researcher, and as well as non-commissioned academic researcher in Singapore Autonomous University to be able to access the unit record level data to do research, right? So in the diagram here, we can see that we share data primarily via the aggregated manner in our SingStat website. There are applications called the SingStat Table Builder, and as well as the SingStat mobile app that offer comprehensive aggregated data. We also have an anonymized microdata access program that allow for academic research.
Try to remove names.
To access the anonymized microdata in a safe environment in order for them to do advanced econometric regression, machine learning analysis, so on and so forth. There is a second act, which is the Public Sector Governance Act, PSGA for short. This pertains to government administrative data that are used both for policy making and service delivery purpose. So the PSGA Act actually enables data sharing within government, within Singapore government, and there are safeguards for under this act to with criminal penalties on public officer who misuse or abuse the data, right? In this case, DOS as a trusted center for individual and business data empower government agency to self-discover data for policy making, operations, as well as service delivery, right? One thing to note is that the Trusted Center does not hold or share data collected under the Stat Act. So we have a segregation of role and duty between the two group of officers. Those that are collecting and handling data under Stat Act will handle the Stat Act data, and those that are under the Trusted Center will handle the PSGA data, and there is no mixing of the role sharing of the data. Okay. Next, I will talk a little bit about the DOS Privacy Preserving Technology Framework, what we call PPTEC for short. Some of you may be familiar. So PPTEC can be broadly broken up into two branches. One is under the data sharing and publishing side. The other one is under the computation side. On the data sharing and publishing side, you can see highlighted here in yellow, the statistical disclosure control method is one that many of us in the NSO are familiar with. We call it SDC for short. It encompasses microdata anonymization and also tabular data protection. Right. So these are the methods that we've used primarily in SingStat Table Builder mobile app and also our microdata access program. Then increasingly over time, we understand that that there is a need for more data sharing and that there are more PPTEC methods that are available. So differential privacy and synthetic data generation are the two methods. And we have done quite a bit of research in recent years on this. I think the motivation to go into this area is understandable because as society progresses, as more data is being shared and as technology becomes more pervasive, there emerge new threats to the NSO. So an example would be differential privacy as a concept existed in the past, actually. Long time ago when I was still in the university, we used to have this method that
necessarily prevent.
And what that does is that it takes sensitive questions in survey. The response from the individual is actually randomized before it's recorded. So there's the precursor before even differential privacy as a concept is being introduced later on. But differential privacy has since then become very popular because I think with technology, a lot of us has mobile phone, a lot of our data are actually possibly shared with the service provider. And in that case, a lot of our individual information can be very sensitive. And therefore, there's a need for them to introduce some kind of randomizing device. And so the differential privacy framework allows for some kind of guarantee of privacy, while for the service provider to be using our data. Right. So differential privacy is something of great importance actually today. So we had a close look at it in recent years. I'll talk a little bit about it in the next slide. So for differential privacy, actually, we look at it quite closely. There are two methods that can be used for differential privacy, differential private data. One is to use the method where noise is injected into aggregated stats. The other one is to actually directly simulate the synthetic data using the DP framework. And generally, the synthetic data method is easier, right? Because there is no need to split the privacy loss budget, the epsilon privacy loss budget over the statistics to be generated. And it maintains consistency between all the stats that are generated. So I think some of the NSO that are implementing could be implementing differential privacy, could be implementing the synthetic data method. For us, we've done the research. Actually, we collaborate with the local IHL here, NUS Encrypt Center. So we test out their DP synthetic data generation algorithm. We have also some of the statisticians doing research on DP. And last year in 2023, we went to ISI World Congress to share one of our research on privacy for a subset of data, on the subset of data set variables. So for us, the private, differentially private synthetic data and synthetic data, right? These are data that are not attributable to records in the original data. And in that sense, we think that they are very promising to improve data sharing while protecting against disclosure of confidential information. Currently, we are using synthetic data for both data exploration as well as facilitating our longitudinal data research projects. Right. So for the longitudinal data research project, we use synthetic data as follow. I think before we talk about synthetic data, how we support the government agency is that for longitudinal data research projects, we would actually strive to provide the data that's required by government agency for their research in the most efficient way. So the first most common way that we would ask them to do is to use a self-service remote query application, which has built-in STC protection. So what the system does is that it will provide the aggregated statistical tables or regression by running them on the fly on the underlying record without showing it to the user, and then returning the aggregated output after all the STC check. So that is actually very helpful for a lot of the studies. Second way is that we'll provide the anonymized microdata in the data lab for the user. And the last way is where we be primarily the one that is performing the statistical analysis. So we call this a service request. And then we will provide the aggregated result to the user after careful check. So for the third way, the service
Data set may have looked like.
We allow for government researcher to request for synthetic data sample in advance. This is to enable them to be able to explore the data to get a better sense of the data structure, and then they could then better produce the scripts that they want to do their advanced econometric model or longitudinal model scripts for our data, for our officer to run on the actual records and then to return them the aggregated result. So this is something that we have done, and we found very good user feedback for it because it really saved a lot of the turnaround time for such projects. And the next way that we use synthetic data is under a trusted center, where we would produce small sample of synthetic data for highly sought after core administrative data set. One thing to clarify is that for the administrative data set, right, it is both for policy analysis and also for service delivery purpose, meaning to say that identifiable data could be requested. But we do not also want people to just request data without establishing that the data will be indeed suitable for their use. So which is why the Trusted Center has created small synthetic data sample that allow for the user to download easily and play with this synthetic data for data exploration. And only after they have established that the data is indeed suitable for their purpose, then they will put up the request for the actual data, right? So our user are actually cautioned that the small sample that they download are actually not meant to be for statistical purpose. Okay, it is only for the purpose of data exploration, and the reason is because there's reduced data utility, right? So how we generate this synthetic data is actually in the method that's outlined here. It uses the Synthepop method that is described earlier on already. So one thing I would just add on to say before I end this is that for DOS, we think that it is very important to provide the user with the most appropriate data service, right? So for example, some users that are not advanced in running scripting, etc., we provide for them the aggregated data either on the 6-stat table builder or on the remote query. And that saves them the trouble of doing coding and handling the microdata. But we also have advanced user, and some of them, if they were to really need the data at the unit record level, then we would provide for them the synthetic data to play with it, and then to provide us the script that we run, for example, in the longitudinal data method, right? Or another way is that we anonymize the microdata and put into the data lab for them to be able to access the record. Now, we find that today is the best way moving forward for us is really that we will want to provide to the user the most cost-efficient way, most efficient way for us to be able to meet the user's need. So therefore, for that reason, we do not spend too much time just into differential private or even some of the more advanced way of generating synthetic data. The reason is that there is that cost of providing the data service that we are mindful of. Yeah. Yeah, so with that, I've come to the end of my sharing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, for sharing very interesting experience of Singapore in using synthetic data. Colleagues, it's now time for Q&A and discussion. We have a couple of minutes left, and I see there is one question in the chat. So would you like, Fabio, would you like to ask a question, or are you happy with the answer that Alistair has already provided in the chat?
It's okay, thank you.
All right, perfect. So do you have any questions, colleagues? If so, you can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. No questions? Alistair, do you want to elaborate something? I feel that you want to say something.
No, Sally,
Oh, okay.
thank you. I've just tried to reply to Ricciato's question. Yeah.
All right. So I see one hand from. Sorry, I cannot see the name. Dipankar. The floor is yours. Please open your mic and ask your question.
Yeah. We know the importance of synthetic data, and we want to mainstreaming or integrating synthetic data into our official statistics. But the point is, it's inferential. How to draw inference in general from this type of data? Yeah. Afsana.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Roy. So, yeah, Alistair or Andy? I see maybe first Andy. You are on mute, Andy. Yeah.
Sorry, I wanted to respond to Chris Jones' question in the chat. So I hands up for that. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So Alistair, you go ahead.
Yes, that
might not be utilized. So
synthetic data is substantively curated, which means you know, as a producer of synthetic data, what inferential validity you've retained, and the metadata about that inferential validity needs to be provided with the synthetic data, because if a user uses the synthetic data, say they've got synthetic microdata, and they try to draw inferences from some of the data and the relationships in the data where the inferential validity has not been retained, then those inferences will not be valid. They'll, substantively, if you're using, say, a fully conditional specification, and all of the data has been done in such a way that the univariate inferential validity has been retained, so that if you look at the results overall, each variable's distribution is the same, but the multivariate inferential validity has not been retained, then any multivariate inferences that somebody might draw are not worth drawing. So that's why the metadata is really important with synthetic data.
Thank you very much, Alistair. Dipankar, did this answer to your question? All right, perfect. So we have one question from Chris in the chat. So Andy, you would like to respond to that?
Yeah, so I think Chris asked the question, were there any expected challenge you face when you produce and deploy synthetic data? So one thing that we learn is that, for example, in differential privacy, right, the moment you deploy the synthetic data method, what happens is that any stats that's generated out from it will contain some noise. And even in areas where there is no confidentiality concerns, small cell count, etc., there will be noise that are injected in.
Most of them will not be used.
So then the question is, how do you make sure that you get good data utility? Although there is that protection guaranteed through differential privacy, the utility then becomes the problem, because if you were to have epsilon value that are more protective on the data, then your utility will go down. So how do you draw the line? I think that then becomes a very difficult question, because in the SDC way of tabular protection, your focus is on the area where
obviously the
could, of course, address those risks specifically. But when you introduce synthetic data, the noise is injected in all queries. And then how do you justify the loss of data utility in areas where there is originally no risk? So there's an area that we need to communicate internally with management.
So the microdata is perhaps
able to convince management. Later on is to convince the public and to educate them to use that in the appropriate way as well. So I think there's a lot of education that is needed, that NSO will need time to work on this. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Alistair, do you also want to reflect on this question?
Yeah, I guess so. So unexpected challenges. So I know one in the US census. So US Census 2020, they had a lot of various people had concerns about the methodology, but there's one particular news article which was about how the US Census published a population for the island that the Statue of Liberty is on, and the population that they published was 48. And the actual population is 0. Everybody knows that. And the reason why it had been published as 48 was because that particular granular cell, that particular geography, for just by happenstance, had got an outlandish random number associated with it, and so rather than reporting it as what its real number was 0, it reported it with a high level of perturbation. And so that's something you have to be aware of where you're using perturbing methods, is that you will potentially end up outputting some data that people will turn around and say, no, that's completely wrong. So a way around that is when you output your synthetic data, you curate it, which means you do data checking on it to say, okay, we've made a synthetic data set which is inferentially valid for various cuts of the original data, but is there anything in here that people are just going to look at and say, this is silly? So I think that's important. It's like the same thing as having a human in the loop when you're dealing with generative AI tools. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alistair. We have a couple of other questions also in the chat. Maybe one of them I respond, which is about the slides that, as I mentioned, they will be uploaded on the Stats Café webpage. So we have one more question from Fabio, which is about the utility of the granular data set. And the other one is about the package of SynthPop. Is it still the best? And also another one, which is that should we produce a full synthetic data or not? So maybe Chris, do you want to take one of them and reply? Or shall I?
I can make an attempt to answer the one from Fabio. I mean, I think it touches on a few things. I think it's possible. I mean, yes, if you know in advance what function is going to be computed from the data, then you can make that match what would be produced from the real data using certain methods. I mean, I think if you don't know how the data is going to be analyzed, you can still produce quite rich synthetic data sets depending on the data available. I think if you have rich enough data to generate synthetic data from, then your output can be a rich data set that may have qualitative features that are might be able in terms of how exactly they would replicate precise analytical results is not so clear to me. There is more than one way of measuring utility. It's worth pointing that out. But I think in terms of the advantage of synthetic data, I mean, one particular use case that's used quite a lot by microdata centers is if your microdata is held in a secure location and the researchers need to travel perhaps to your capital city to come to your stats office or the data center and run their code on this microdata. One use case of synthetic data is to provide an interim data set so that the researchers can refine their analyses on the synthetic data before running the code and generating final results on the real data at the location of the secure data center. So that it just minimizes the number of trips to the place where the microdata is stored. It reduces the amount of time that they spend there, and maybe they can be looking at the synthetic data while they're waiting for permission to access the microdata, which can sometimes be a lengthy process. I think that partially answers some part of Fabio's question. Thanks.
Thank you
not
very
all
much.
of it.
Thank you, Chris. We have gone over time, but maybe if it is possible, quickly respond to questions. And SynthPop, Andy, you want to take that one?
As hard as possible to identify.
Actually, SynthPop I think is available. And actually, is it the best? We can't really address this. My own view is this: you could actually push the limit even to do GAN, general adversarial network. But the question is the cost. So for us, I think SynthPop is a very low cost for us to do and use it. But if you were to do a general adversarial network, then it will be more costly. And I think one aspect for us as a small NSO is that the efficiency and cost effectiveness for data services is an important question. I have very few manpower here. So it's something we need to think about, because I noticed reading through the guide that in a lot of cases where NSO actually shares synthetic data with researcher, you always go back to telling the researcher, say, when you want to finally have your final model, bring your code to me and I'll run it to give you your final data. So in my mind, I think having the best synthetic data is perhaps not the right tree for us to be seeking after, but your synthetic data should be reasonably good enough for your researcher to get an idea of what they want, and then for them to pass you the code and you run it and give them the result that they need. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andy. And I see that Alistair also replied to this question. We also have 2 more questions, but if you allow me, we stop here, and I would ask colleagues Chris, Andy, and Alistair, if you could provide answers in the chat box, that would be great. And I would like now to share with you the evaluation survey of Asia-Pacific Stats Café series. It would be great if you could scan this QR code and reply to the question, so we would know that how we should move in the future to make the Stats Café sessions more beneficial to all of you. So please scan it. It doesn't take much time, just a few minutes. And now I hand back to Rachel for some closing remarks, and I thank everyone, all the panelists. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Afsani, for moderating, and thank you to all the presenters. I'm not going to try and summarize, but I would just like to say a huge thank you for sharing what you have, but also for really highlighting not just the technical issues, but also the real importance of engaging with users and making sure that they kind of understand these issues and that we're really meeting their needs. So thank you so much. And of course, not just the presenters, but also huge thanks to all the participants. And I know I think we got up to nearly 100 through the session. So that really shows the interest in the topic. So thank you to everyone for engaging, for sharing your experience, for asking the questions. And do please, look at the resources that were provided, the various links. And we will continue to engage. Please also do fill in the evaluation and let us know what other topics and things you would like to hear about in future Stats Cafes. So huge thank you to everyone and have a good rest of the day. Thank you.